Not quite correct. I'm not a native. I'm from Southern California. Sorry. But I'm almost a native. I mean, I went through, my dad was a dairy farmer in Southern California. My grandfather was a dairy farmer in Southern California, and they were like, we gotta get out of here. And so my dad had cousins up here, and moved up here, and bought a farm here when I was a kid. So I'm almost a native, not quite. So this is our farm, and I put this up here because you can't see it very well, I guess. It's tiny, but there are two weather vanes on our barn, and one is a cow and one is a salmon. So the watersheds that have defined my life, Southern California, I was 12 years old when we moved away, and I remember just going to the little creek and watching the minnows and watching spiders catch stuff and just being fascinated with that little creek. And it's now industrial warehouses and golf course, and sad. So I don't go back there anymore. But we moved to Washington, and I have pretty much lived most of my life in either the Fish Trap or the Bertrand. We now farm in both watersheds. And every day when I go up to Trinity Western, I travel the Bertrand watershed up, and then we go over the ridge, and then I'm in the Salmon River watershed, and that runs right through our campus, and we love the Salmon River as well up in Canada. So is anyone here live in the Bertrand watershed?
Yes.
Okay. And hopefully we'll get a few more people as the day goes on. I was just curious about that. So the red arrow on the lower end here is where you are sitting right now, which is Berthelsen Park. And then the red arrow up at the top is our farm on Maxwell Road. So I did not have to come very far. I'm ashamed to say I did not ride my bike. I should have done that. So the two transboundary watersheds that are often considered sister watersheds, as many of you may know. This is a Canadian, sort of a little bit Canadian biased map. And then this is a more U.S. biased map of the same two watersheds showing the roads on the U.S. side, and this is typical. I've been paying attention to these watersheds for a few decades now, and the maps tend to stop at the border, and so the transboundary communication has not always been strong. But about half the watershed, of course, is up in Canada. So a little bit of the history, I said I would give some little older history of this creek. For some of you, this may be old news. I was kind of interested to go on to the Bertrand Creek Enhancement Society, which is a Canadian entity website, and realized that they had lifted from the State of the Watershed report that we worked on quite a few years ago, which I had actually written the text, and then I'm like, oh, this sounds familiar, I wrote this. But trying to summarize a little bit of this, I think it's a very interesting history, including smugglers and whiskey floating down during Prohibition and all kinds of intriguing things about Bertrand Creek. We still have interesting issues. As a corridor for wildlife, it's also a corridor for smugglers, and so we have a little bit of that activity in our neighborhood, and we sort of welcome the Border Patrol hanging around. But officially, the Bertrand Creek name did not come in until James Bertrand, who was one of the surveyors of the 49th parallel, was here and ended up settling in what later was called the Bertrand Prairie. So the Sicklemeckle, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, was the original name from what we find in the history books. And the prairie, which we look at the Bertrand watershed right around us here, this beautiful park, and we think, oh, this was all big trees. It was not. It was a lot of sort of open and scrub, and was undoubtedly burned at times in order to do some agricultural activities, and camas was dug and so on. But there are still some very big stumps and some second growth along the creek itself to the north of here. So the thing I want to point out about James Bertrand, who married a native woman and lived over 100 years, Scaleel, who lived right up near the border along the creek and was recorded to live to about 125 years, and then starts to sound kind of biblical. Lockenham, apparently he lived well. I do not have an age on him. He was at the mouth of the Bertrand, between the Bertrand and Fish Trap, where they both opened, which is where I grew up when I was a kid. That's where our other farm is located. was a wonderful fish trapping area as well as just a very rich soil. So even before the European settlers, this was a rich area, and people lived to be old. So it's kind of like the land of milk and honey. So here's the Loomis Trail to Barnhart Riparian Wetland Chain along Bertrand Creek. So again, here's the park. And then, does this have a laser?
It does, it's the red button.
So again, we're sitting right here, and here's the stream coming through the park and then going all the way up the border. Of course, this is one of those maps that stops at the border. And you see a lot of sort of small wetland areas. And then there's this whole big complex up here, which is also part of this watershed. And then, of course, the ditching, which has happened as it was, clearly made into farmland. But much of this, from what we know up here, and especially over to the east side of the watershed, was probably not heavily treated. It was this kind of very flat and what turned out to be very, very rich soil. So this has long been held up as a remarkable example of intact riparian, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, why that's true. The sandy loam, Bertrand sandy loam, is a prime soil, as many of you are undoubtedly aware. This is the top raspberry producing county in the nation. If you could talk about counties on a worldwide basis, and this particular watershed is the epicenter of that. Of course, that particular type of soil grows many other things as well. So John Potgitter homesteaded our farm. He's not related to us. The farm came into my husband's grandparents' possession later on. But we have records from 1900 where John Potgitter described the region to others who he was trying to lure to move to this region. He said, here we have every fruit, apples, plums, berries, no want for anything. The water runs through the ditches the whole year. The creeks have the nicest trout, the largest salmon in the fall. The trees are beautiful. Here is rich land, a mild climate. Anything closer to heaven on earth you could not find. And at this moment, you could come to my place, and you could, at this moment, gorge on cherries, strawberries, and raspberries, which are all just, what we grow in our yard. It is incredible soil, and we have a garden every year, and it's just a wonderful place to live. I have to mention Berthelsen Park because we're here, because he was very connected to the creek as well. So Hans Berthelsen homesteaded about 240 acres, probably larger initially. He may have sold off part of it, but he ended up with about 240 acres, which is to this day owned by the city of Linden. And the barn, which you drove past on your way in, looked like this, and a lot of the trees were taken down right around that area at that point that he built the barn. He built it with just himself and a horse, and it was the largest barn in the region at that time, so it's on the National Register of Historic Places if you get a chance to take a walk later. So Hans and Lyda, his wife Lyda, spent many years on their estate, and one of the quotes is their love and affection for their trees made the trees seem almost human, and they actually knew each tree and very specifically protected those. And so this quote by Robert Emmett Hawley, who was actually Lyda's brother, says, "Those who live their lives close to nature develop a sense of beauty and depth of sympathy far beyond the ordinary, making of their lives an animated poem." So in 1943, Lyda died. This is a poor quality photo, but we have Robert Hawley here, and then Lyda and Hans. This was taken some years before Hans and Lyda passed away. She passed away in late 1943, and a few months later, Hans also passed away. And at that time, the quote from the Hawley's book is that, in the old homestead by sunny babbling Bertrand, in the shadows of the trees he loved, and then he deeded, very specifically wanted to have the 20 acres of virgin timber, or old growth, left to the city of Linden as a park, including the additional land. So the entire estate, including actively farmed land to the west of here, which is still leased for farming, was given to the city of Linden. And his goal was that people would be able to understand what it was like here when the trees were still in place. Later, residents who have all passed on, but who I had conversations with years ago, spoke about the various wildlife that was here well into the mid and late 20th century. And in the last 50 years, we've seen a lot of transition to urbanization, although we still have overwhelmingly agriculture in this watershed. And so we have this combination of agriculture, and as you had mentioned, you know, it's that mixture of farms and riparian that can work, and so much better than urbanization would work. So we want to preserve farmland. So here's a map again of the U.S. portion of the watershed, showing some of that corridor, the darker green. So here's the park. This map is focused on the wetlands, but very good connection all through some of these yellow areas where we've had active enhancement projects in the past. The H Street, what I call the H Street Beaver Pond wetland complex, right up along the border, is actually not visible unless you're on the Canadian side on Zero Avenue, and some of you may be very familiar with that area. However, development has been occurring around that and pressing on that as well. And then the Whatcom Axland Wetland Complex is a smaller complex, which I think is just fascinating and has some thread of development. There's been development around it. It's just, I mean, this is kind of a wonderful wildlife corridor. And we'll talk about some of the wildlife in a moment here. So reasons for the attacked corridor are deliberate long-term choices by multi-generation, landowners, very deliberate in some parts of this, at least on the U.S. side, and also kind of accidental. Property lines that did not follow the creek, which is wise because the creek meanders and changes over time. Property lines that did not follow the creek tended to leave orphan pieces of land on opposite sides of the creek from where you farm. So we, for instance, have like a less than 1 acre orphan piece on the east side of Bertrand Creek, but the rest of our farm is all on the west side of Bertrand Creek. But we very deliberately, my husband's grandfather was not one of those farmers who came and said, we need to clear this all up to the edge. He always left trees, and we've tried to further enhance that over the years. That has happened in such a way that we have this very nice pathway, particularly from Berthelsen Park to the border, that is pretty well treed, as you probably know. So about a half mile of the creek is right here at the park. That's helpful. And that lack of urban density, of course, has been helpful. So the watershed species list, I'm going to whip through this pretty quickly, and this is pretty cursory. This is just like me, what I've seen, over 30-some years of living in this watershed. And some of the reasons that this list is, what it is because, again, we have this old growth forest. Is the last remaining little bit of old growth forest in lower Whatcom County. So because it's a lower elevation old growth forest, it has different species than we would see up the hill. Rare fungi and bryophytes, some 100-year second growth along the Axland-Jackson corridor, and then these large wetland complexes that we mentioned. So freshwater bivalves still present. So some of the fish, this is probably familiar to many of you. Is Mike Pearson here? Who's going to come? He's our Mr. Biologist at the Bertrand Creek north of the border. Some of the amphibians, reptiles, and then bird pages can go on. And I am not exhaustive in bird lists at all. Some of you could probably add to this. I've worked a lot with American kestrels because we've been trying to introduce them back to the area and build up their population for the purposes of benefiting farmland, but also just because they used to be here and we want them back. Various owls, and a whole collection of other birds. The pileated woodpecker, at least until a year or two ago, was just north of the park. But there's a development that's a pretty intense development that's happening just north of the park, sadly, at this point. And then swallows, chickadees, thrushes, European starling, which of course is invasive, and that's one of the reasons I'm working with kestrels, is because of the problems with starlings. And then a whole collection of other birds. And then the mammals are pretty interesting. So we still have Flying squirrels, we have various other rodents, Townsend's vole and Townsend's mole, and lots and lots of other shrews and things that I haven't even listed. Of course, the possum, and then the carnivores. This is just fantastic. So, except for the badger, I have personally seen all of these carnivores, either on our land or on, immediately adjacent, running through this Bertrand Creek corridor, getting up to the wetland complex. We've had 4 of our dairy animals killed by cougar over the decades. 3 of them were young calves that were out right in our orchard next to our house. And then we've had a 10-year-old milk cow that was taken down by a cougar because we pasture, and we pasture to the far pasture where we can't see what's going on. We had a 10-year-old Holstein. These girls are big. Who was sadly a bit slow because she had calved, and the whole herd came running back at about 9:30 at night, and we didn't realize till the next morning that when we milked that we were short an animal, and my husband went out and she had been taken down by a cougar. So it's sort of like the Serengeti out there. If you're slow, they're going to get you. We as farmers would say, wow, that's a loss, but we also feel really proud that we actually have wildlife that, at that level living on our farm. So just a fish sampling site from Robert Vedas, and this is showing a study from the past that this mid-upper area had some of the highest fish diversity, and that is again the U.S.-Canada border at the top here, but that's right in this area. So pretty rich landscape. So who are the stakeholders? And you all know these answers, of course, the Native Americans who traditionally have harvested salmon and shellfish, the fishers and the foresters, the farmers. This is my dad out making hay a few years ago on our field. Immediately adjacent, that's Bertrand, right there behind him. Other landowners and citizens, obviously. I pulled a few of these pictures from the fish trap stayed in the watershed. Other wildlife, so this is my daughter with one of the young kestrels that we released. We released 21 translocated with federal permits from eastern Washington where kestrels are plentiful and released. And we think we have a population increase number. We're trying to get that hard science numbers to back that up right now. Healthy and productive watersheds should ideally support all of the stakeholders, and that's a little bit of what you had talked about earlier, but we end up with problems, and it becomes the shellfish versus the cows, the environmentalist versus the farmer, the developer versus agriculture, which I think is a common issue for both the scientists and the regulators and the agriculture, that's the common problem. And then water. This is more, my sense is that this particular meeting, I hope to learn more from the rest of you, but is that this is more about water quality than water quantity, but water quantity is a huge problem, especially this year. This is the worst we've ever seen in our lifetimes farming. So some of the past work, there has been work, we haven't had a conference exactly like this, and Nicole has, the Conservation District has pulled this together, but we've had various presentations. The top is a poster that one of my undergrad thesis students worked on probably about 10 years ago, and some of the maps that are used come from her work. And then this is a presentation that Doug Allen was involved with. This sign, I believe, is still standing at the border, but is much faded at this point. We had a big field trip where we had dignitaries from both sides of the border. People shook hands and cut ribbons, and we talked about it, what happened really. But it's, there is the effort to speak about it. So here's a big part of the story. If my husband were here, he's really lived pretty much his entire life, except for 4 years at WSU and a couple years working somewhere else before he came back to the farm. This is a flashy stream hydrologically. It always went up quickly when there was a rainfall, but that became much more pronounced as things changed in the landscape. So here's 1954, not long before my husband was born. And you see just lots and lots of dark green forest, lighter green agriculture, and a little bit of pink, particularly north of the line, almost none here, which represents the urban areas of pavement. And here we are 10 years ago, 2004, and pink, pink, pink. So at Aldi Grove, and even since 2004, further, the dark pink is heavily urbanized, the lighter pink is a little more of the sort of suburban, rural intensification of pavement development. And you see more pink happening here, and you also see the city of Linden. Well, now, 10 years have passed, city of Linden is dark pink all the way out to here. It's prime farmland that was taken by the city of Linden for zoning purposes that we need industry to support, so there's a huge, I think it's a $28 million freezer complex that's now being built out here. It's a massive amount of impermeable surface. It is supporting, it will support agriculture, in that it's a freezer complex for agriculture, but it still just makes me sick because of the soil that's underneath that. And then Bertrand Park remains, of course, and then this pink right here is now completely pink. There's very intensive housing happening here and along this other side of Bertrand Park. This is all subdivided into about 6 lots here and then about 20 up here, and so on, and this prime riparian in agriculture. So this, the signs that go up to inform people of their watersheds, that's great. People know what watershed they're in. You also notice, not too far. Whoa. Wait, other way, the wrong way. Here we go. Okay, I need to hit my red button. So this is right along H Street. There are now about 5 mansions there. Again, a big chunk of very nice farmland that's lawn. So the challenges, land use has obviously shifted to a more intensive pattern, and can the remaining intensified ag land still be compatible with Bertrand watershed health? So not only do we have more pavement in the watershed, the remaining agricultural land is being used more intensively. So as you shrink that down, farmers are pressured to grow more and more food on less and less land, and that's what leads to issues, less available land. And so instead of grazing your cows as a dairy farmer, you end up bringing the crops to the cows, keeping them, inside. You can control everything. You can presumably, you can get a better return on your land by doing that intensification. But that can be at a cost to the environment. So this is just a quote from Aldo Leopold, and this is not the Bertrand watershed, and this is not my cow, and this is not New Mexico. But there's if you're familiar with Aldo Leopold's work, there's a point where he talks about the erosion and destruction of the arroyos of New Mexico. And then he says the University of New Mexico has done well to preserve this saga of how the state was made safe for cows, how the state is made safe from cows is the saga yet to be written. And so we've sort of demonized cows in the stream. But the reality is, at light, sort of back, when John Potgetter was living on our farm, at sort of a very light level of having a few cows, and occasionally they're crossing the stream or drinking from the stream, it wasn't an issue. But it's when we started to have too many. So, here we go. Why is that being so slow? Huh. Okay, well, I went too far, and I probably need to quit, don't I? Okay. It's like it's not keeping up with my buttons here. Okay, so
Which way do you want to go?
I want to go forward. Okay, there we go. That's good. So if you have very intensive grazing levels, obviously you're going to decrease the productivity. This is a Bertrand watershed sheep hobby farm, I guess, probably north of the border, just north of the Zero Ave. a few years ago, and you start to see invasive species coming in. Pastures aren't well managed. Of course, sheep and cowmen don't get along. Sheepmen and cowmen don't get along generally, but sheep do, cause some grazing issues. And also, with dairy cattle. So this is actually on our farm. We do graze. We're one of the 3% in the nation who graze our dairy animals, and you can only do that if you have a fairly low stocking density and you don't have a huge farm. So this can, though, disrupt soil cycles and cause erosion if it's not done well. So 97% of all herds across North America are in total confinement year-round, except for maybe the young stock or the dry cows who are currently in milk. And then so you harvest and then store during spring and summer. And put your silage stacks. This is the one year that I convinced my husband to do sod on the top of the stack instead of plastic, and it worked really well. And then the second year he agreed to do it again, and it didn't germinate properly, and so he said, "I'm never doing that again." He had 50-50, and it's like that was it for him. He was not. Anyway, so seasonal grazing can play a role, but only on the few, organic dairies or dairies that are doing, as we are, we're not organic, but we're doing it for choices because we think it's the thing we want to do. It has to be very light stocking density and extreme care in the rotations. So how does aquatic resource management work with more intensive agriculture? One of the things that we've seen is conversion from not necessarily fewer cows, but conversion in general in this county to berries. There always were some berries along with the dairies stretching back into the mid part of last century, but this is a different type of thing. It's very intense. So you tend to see erosion happening not because animals are in the stream, but because people haven't maintained a riparian buffer, they planted too close to the edge, and so on. So all the issues that come with that. The constant cultivating, so when we're in grass, we tend to leave it in grass for at least 10 years. Our corn, we will rotate with grass to try to build up the soil because just cultivate every year. You have to do a lot of inputs in order to keep that up. And of course, pesticides that can be added to the system in conventional ag, and sediments can go into the streams. So channelization, of course, is some of that is historic, and before most people now were farming, maybe some of their ancestors have been part of that, but we do have some ditches on our farm. But when you, of course, try to farm right up to the edge and make straight shots. So, but we're dealing with a lot of Dutch Calvinist farmers, and they like everything to be neat and tidy. How do we convince these people that we need to go to, meanders? So they aren't all like that. And so my husband's grandfather, who was a Dutch immigrant, never wanted that. He always wanted to leave the meanders. He always wanted to leave the trees. So it's not fair to totally stereotype, but it's kind of funny. So seeking a balance of leaving those corridors, including the meanders, and then maintaining the buffers. So this is the Bertrand Creek name stem in the background. This is several years ago when we reseeded that particular grass field. And then, of course, using precision in your manure application so that you don't get too close. This is probably about 15 years ago. We had enhanced and put more buffer, not with prep, we just wanted to do that. My husband is not one who's probably going to sign up for CREP necessarily. He just wants to do it. So we had added, and you can see those fir trees, and they're now almost as tall as the cottonwoods and alders in the background. And then some of the worksheets that we go through, probably not an updated one there, but BC Ministry of Ag and Lands also has their rules and regulations with farm plans. And then the NC folks have helped a lot with just doing some of these plantings and doing the maintenance, doing the fish surveys to see what we've got. There's some of the restored areas, not on our stretch, but just north of us. And the one school that's in the Bertrand Watershed is the Ebenezer Christian School, which is a little school right on the Guide Meridian. It still kind of looks like the one-room schoolhouse. It's over 100 years old. My husband went there, my kids went there. And we had a lot of problems with middle schoolers doing ATVs in areas that we were trying to restore, both on our land and neighbors. And so we thought we'll get middle schoolers to make the posters and laminate them and put them out there. And it seems to help, but we do have that problem again. So as most of you know, you can really have a win-win. This is looking south on our land along that Bertrand corridor. Buffer zone, this is straight out from our main farmstead. So that's an orchid piece in front of you, which has some very nice big trees. And then the problem, I think, is making that communication that buffers are a win-win for farmers. We see the stemming of erosion and the increasing of beneficial wildlife species, coyotes, that will clean up. You know, if you have a dead calf, like a stillborn calf, and you drag it way out there, the coyotes will have it gone, and the eagles, within 48 hours, it will be completely gone. And to us, that's a benefit. Having the swallows that are out there eating spotted wing Drosophila. These are things that we need to push with farmers. And so this is pulled from a Fish Trap Creek State of the Watershed, just how to think about the past, reflect and imagine, and this is kind of my final shot here. Respect the history, respect the knowledge of the landscape itself. Wes Jackson has said consult the genius of the place, meaning the place itself, but also the genius with a capital G is the farmer. They've been there. They know what's going on. But you have to gain their respect by not coming down with heavy hammers. Okay, that's it.